yeah, let's move on to the Saturday game. And the game that we wanted to highlight on Saturday was Hoffenheim against St Pauli. We did speak a little bit about Hoffenheim midweek in the German Cup result, right? But this match is fascinating because I mean St Pauli, really really fascinating club to follow, and because I think of what's going on in and around them in the Bundesliga, maybe a little bit fortunate too, that other teams around them are just so poor that they might actually be able to survive. Blessing, trying to keep working with this team, trying to make them Bundesliga ready, and is given the time to do so. And on the other hand, Hoffenheim, we talked about the game against Nuremberg, the 2-1 win against Nuremberg, the fact that Pellegrino Matarazzo, the situation that he's dealing with the club is just so very fascinating that we wanted to park a little bit of time for it. Kickers spent some time talking about them, and they highlighted that several key players are running out of contract. Among them, Kramaric and Tom Bischoff, was, we spoke about him midweek, one of the very young and talented players, but Pavel Karabarak, David Jurasek, Mark Jun, Samaseko, Luca Philipp, and Jakob Brun Larsen are the other players who see their contracts expiring. Hoffenheim don't have, they just completely turned over the entire sporting director team, right? Pellegrino Matarazzo, sort of the last standing survivor. And on top of that, we know that Roger Wittmann, the all-powerful agent of Rogon in German football, has a separate budget at Hoffenheim to park players there, Stefan. So he will have a big say on what's going to happen there. But I mean, it just kind of feels like this is such a difficult season for Hoffenheim with everything that's going on. There's the fact that there is such a power vacuum at the top, not with decision makers coming and going. And I think it is so very fascinating how Matarazzo seems to be trying to navigate the situation, but also, and I think this is the oddity. Like Matt and I were talking about that in one of the previous shows, that we feel that maybe Hoffenheim is one of these teams that could maybe go down, but might be just safe because in Bochum, Kiel, and St Pauli, there's three teams that kind of have cemented that bottom three for themselves, right? But it's just such an odd club at the moment, and with so many things just going off right now, it is, I think, worth spending a tiny bit of time on them before we move on to St. Pauli.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what's going on at Hoffenheim? It seems to be an absolute mess for a club at the moment. I think we have to kind of separate two separate things. There's obviously what's going on boardroom level, as you said, and who owns the club and who's running the club and what happens there going forward, because, it's probably worth noting that for people who maybe don't follow German football that much or don't take a particular interest in the Hoffenheim, they are a club that was very purpose-built by a software billionaire, maybe. I don't know if he's a billionaire, maybe a millionaire, multi-millionaire.
He's a billionaire. He's one of the richest people in Germany.
Okay, yeah. I know he made his money in the 90s, so I wasn't sure if it was if it compounded up to $1 billion, but that tends to be what happens easily when you have lots of money. It tends to turn into more money. They were a very smartly run club, and I remember writing about them when Georgino Rutter left to go to Leeds, and writing a piece about how Hoffenheim have really benefited over the years from this amount of this money, obviously, which has kind of taken them artificially above their station, because they're not a club with a huge support, haven't been a historical club in German football, but also how they've used that to their benefit in the sense that they've been a club that can bring in young players from anywhere in the world. And because Hoffenheim's really in the middle of nowhere, and it's a club that doesn't have a huge amount of expectations, there's next to zero media attention around them, it means that they can bring in these players, and it's almost like they're at a summer camp, and they can just develop in their own time, and then obviously test their mettle in the Bundesliga, and then they can move on. Georgino Rutter's a good example of that, but the one that always stands out to me is Roberto Firmino, actually, who obviously went on to Liverpool. Obviously, I'm kind of winding back the clock there, talking about him, but so, that was Hoffenheim at their best, but if they don't have that kind of sugar daddy paying the bills anymore, or if they don't have the recruitment strategy in place to scout these young players, and if there suddenly is a huge amount of media interest or scrutiny or drama around them because of, the fans aren't happy with the club, or the club's in the middle of a kind of tumultuous kind of turnover of owners and administrators, then that all gets easily disrupted, and suddenly the few things that made Hoffenheim tick no longer tick, and that's what suddenly gets in the way of players coming there. Because if you're a young player from Brazil who wants to develop and become a star in European football, a club like Hoffenheim in the past was probably quite appealing, because you can get your head down, you can work hard, and then obviously in a couple of seasons you can move on to England, Spain, Bayern Munich, whatever. But if Hoffenheim aren't doing that anymore, then they start to become appealing. That kind of conveyor belt of young players who can join the club kind of dries up, and the whole thing begins to kind of fall apart. Then on the other side, you have what's happening on the pitch, where, as you said, there's a kind of transition from younger players to hopefully replacing the older ones. They're still so relying on Andrej Kramaric, who's now, 34, 35 years old, I think. Part of that really incredible Croatian generation of footballers who are just seemingly made of granite, who just never seem to get old. But they have had their struggles. But interestingly enough, on the pitch, I would say they've almost kind of turned a corner. It all came down to that Bochum game, I thought, which they won 3-1, which led to Bochum losing their head coach, but Matarazzo was kept on. Pushing aside the Champions League games to one side, because I think the Champions League the Europa League performances are just entirely besides the point. I don't think anyone's really been paying attention to those games anymore for Hoffenheim. But then they drew a 0-0 away with Heidenheim, which is a good result. Then obviously they beat Nuremberg 2-1 in the Pokal, which you watched, Manu. So, I mean, what did you think of their actual performances on the pitch? Putting aside the noise off the pitch, do you think this is a team who are actually playing for Matarazzo, and do you think he's turning things around for them?
Yeah, no, I do think that, and I actually think the Europa League shows that too, right? He has brought in some young players that have really kind of in the right situation. The Morstad goal in that can't remember who they played. I think it was somewhere in Norway where he scored an absolutely worthy, right, to give Hoffenheim the win. He is making the right decisions to turn around games at the right moment, and key games as well, right? The German Cup is important for them because it's financially quite a viable competition. And so, I do sense that the players are playing for him, and I also think that Matarazzo is doing a lot of the right things in terms of really giving young players the chance to kind of develop, right, at the right time. The one thing is, though, like, if it's always is the politics in the background, they're always so hard to judge, right? Like, the players can play for him all they want, but if the new sporting director has no interest in working with him, what can you do, right? So I do sense that the players are playing for him, but I'm not sure if it makes as big of a difference as we maybe think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens. And they go into this game against a very difficult St Pauli side, don't they? Who, interestingly enough, in midweek seem to have a really good go of it against Leipzig, where they're a team who have, I mean, when I look at St Pauli this season, they've, interestingly enough, been very good defensively. And I was looking at the stats before we came on the air there, and what really stands out to me about St Pauli is that if you actually look at the XG they've conceded this season, so basically the amount of chances that they've conceded, they're actually quite comfortably mid-table. In terms of the teams that have conceded the most chances, it's Bochum, then Hoffenheim, then Holstein Kiel, Wolfsburg, Mainz, Frankfurt, Gladbach, Stuttgart, Heidenheim, then St Pauli. That's in terms of XG conceded. If you want to kind of go based on old-fashioned stats like shots on target, they're again mid-table there. So, in terms of actual defensive work, they have done very well. The only problem is that they've just not really scored any goals. They haven't scored a single goal at home this season in the Bundesliga. They've only picked up 5 goals in 4 games away from home. But having said that, they do tend to do a little better away from home. They scored against Dortmund in a game which wasn't terribly poor from them, I thought. They, 2-1 defeats, not the worst thing in the world. They then beat Freiburg 3-0 completely out of the blue They got a goal against Augsburg as well, and then a very narrow defeat to Union Berlin at the start of the season, which was 1-0. So I'm intrigued to see how this goes for Hoffenheim and for St Pauli, actually, because I think it might be a really, really tricky match for Hoffenheim, and I actually wouldn't be entirely surprised if St Pauli actually takes something from this game, Manu.
Yeah, and if they win this game, they draw even on points. Hoffenheim, right? Both are on 8 at the moment. I think that is really something to keep an eye on, right? How are they going to do in this match? And you are quite right in pointing out the defensive issues that St. Pauli is, this defensive strength that St. Pauli had, and how odd it was today against Leipzig. They didn't show that. It's actually something that I think was really quite noticeable. Like, to score 2 times against Leipzig and still not get the result that to maybe go through to the next round. I thought they played really well in that match. This Leipzig side, especially defensively, is so very strong this season. We highlighted that they have the best defense in the Bundesliga at the moment, right? So for St. Pauli to go there and to score 2 goals, that's a really big positive. And maybe if they had been a bit better defensively, they could have really taken something away from that match. So yeah, I think this is going to be a really fascinating game to watch. And I mean, at some point soon, Blessin, I think, both you and I agree, Blessin is one of the more interesting coaches in German football. He's a guy who has come with a very interesting career background. He comes from that Union St. kind of school of thought, the club that's also owned by Brighton. And we all know the management of Brighton is very clever in the way that they work. So St. Pauli, I think, really did a really good job of targeting. And you know what I think is really different between St. Pauli and maybe the other 2 teams, Bochum and Holstein Kiel, that are down there? I do see progress here. That is the one thing that I noticed a little bit. This team is getting used to Bundesliga football a bit quicker than those 2 other teams. I mean, we actually, interesting enough, had Bochum here for a visit in Victoria, because they have a partnership with Pacific FC, the Canadian Premier League team. And don't worry, I'll have something on that soon. But it just feels like they're so lost at the moment, and I don't get that same sense. Were they looking for a head coach? I think they're looking for anything. To be quite honest with you, I'm not sure what a partnership with a Canadian Premier League team will give them in the short term. That's something I'm still trying to figure out myself. But they're here, the decision makers are here, and they are acknowledged to me that the situation is really, really difficult at the moment at home. And I don't quite get that same sense of St. Pauli, Stefan. So, if you're a St. Pauli fan and listening to this podcast, that's definitely something that I feel is very different to maybe some of the other teams in that bottom category there.
Yeah. I think the only thing to maybe, before we wrap up, maybe is just also add that St. Pauli have Hoffenheim away. Like I said, a game that I think they should be going in to try and win, who the Hoffenheim have been playing. They then play Bayern Munich at home, which is a complete write-off, but it's a game in front of their own fans. They can sit deep, do what they can, frustrate Bayern. It's a complete free hit. No one's expecting to win. Then they have Gladbach away, then Holstein Kiel at home. So over the course of these next 4 games, that's 3 games that they could feasibly win. It's 3 games. It's 3 games against clubs who are in disarray, who are on the verge of sacking their head coach, who are below them in the league. That's exactly where Blessin should be thinking, right, we've built a foundation, we're putting good performances, because if you do kind of look at underlying numbers for not Gladbach, for St. Pauli, they do have, they're very, very thin margins. For example, the game they lost to Mainz. Mainz's XG was only 1.3. St. Pauli's was 0.81, and they lost 3-0. So that's a good example of it. Where they're not giving away a huge amount of chances. They're creating as many as a lot of these clubs, but they're just not picking up the points. And those 3 games in particular, I think, are ones that St. Pauli should have circled on the calendar, saying, right, this is what makes or breaks the start of our season for us, I think.
No, 100%, 100%. And then St. Pauli is an interesting story that we're going to keep an eye on.